Okay, so we've been talking about the time between the New Testament, or sorry, the Old Testament and the New Testament, at least if we're going to speak it chronologically. And we were looking last week at what? How many of you were paying, I just need one of you that's paying attention actually.
Classical Greek.
Classical Greece, yes. Okay, so classical Greece is one of the divisions of ancient Greece, as opposed, I guess, to modern Greece, which is not really as interesting to talk about. Although they've had a lot of interesting civil wars, so there's that. But for the most part, classical Greece is what most people are interested in, because that's the period of history where so much of the influence on Western culture took place, and continues to resonate in Western culture in a lot of ways. But so what we were looking at last week was the period of time prior to the conquests of Alexander the Great. Now, we talked about Alexander the Great's conquests the week before last, so we're not going to go back through and detail all those again. But essentially what we were looking at last week was all of the different things that took place in the development of the Greek Empire over a period of about 300 years or 400 years or so, when they went from being a relatively small coalition of city-states in the Greek area to gaining enough power to where that ultimately under Alexander the Great they were able to conquer all of the Babylonian and Persian Empire. And so we finished last week by looking at some of the different impacts that the things that had gone on in Palestine, in Judah, or in Judea in particular, and looking at some of those events that took place there. And we didn't have time to get into Alexander himself, but that's okay, because that leads us straight into the next aspect of this that we want to look at. So let's go back, and we've been using Daniel as kind of the basis for this study, because he is the one prophet, the one individual who has a lot to say about the time between the Testaments, not in terms of recounting the history of it, but in terms of giving prophecies about it. And so we've seen this particular prophecy before, but he says, I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which would have been at the capital of, Susa was the capital of the Persian Empire. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal, and then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power. But he did as he pleased and magnified himself. While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had the 2 horns and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. And then the angel gives him he encounters an angel, gives him an interpretation of the dream. And the angel says, the ram which you saw with the 2 horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. So the smaller horn was Media, the greater horn was Persia, because Persia would become the greater empire. Then it says the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. The broken horn and the 4 horns that arose in its place represent 4 kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. And so today we're going to be taking a look at Hellenistic Greece. Hellenistic Greece is distinguished from classical Greece, and we'll talk about why that is in a second here. So, Hellenism, or the term Hellenistic, where does that come from? Well, a lot of people think that Hellenistic comes from Helen of Troy because of the story of the Trojan War, which the Greeks were one of the 2 major players on it, and which, in terms of the stories in antiquity, was one of the great mythological stories of when the Greeks all banded together to gang up and go to war, and therefore the idea is that, Hellenism is something related to Helen of Troy. That is not correct. Okay, Hellenism actually comes from the word Hellas, which is how ancient Greece was often referred to. In fact, It was more common to call it Hellas until near the end of the Greek Empire, towards the point where the Romans became the dominant force, than it was to call it Greece. So when we talk about Hellenism, we're talking about the culture, language, philosophies, and ultimately the empire itself of Greece. And so if you think about it in the scriptures, there are times where there's references in the New Testament, in particular in the Gospels, to the Hellenistic Jews. Those were Jews who had largely adopted Greek culture and language and philosophies and some of those kinds of things. And so that phrase Hellenistic is a reference not just to what Greece was trying to do, but also to the people who accepted that approach. Okay, so we're gonna see that ultimately, as Alexander spreads the empire, the message of Greek culture spreads with it, and it's a powerful message in a lot of ways, because number one, Alexander is tremendously successful, so people want to emulate success. So that's part of what's driving it. But also, it's a different way of thinking about things than most of these people have ever had before. Most of these people have lived in and had very kind of narrow lives that are driven by pagan cultures, which Greece is as well. But they're driven by a very kind of simplistic way of looking at things, and they tend to answer to their king or the governor or whatever it is. There's not a lot of sense of self at all. I don't mean like just self-value, but there's not a lot of sense of self. There's not a lot of thinking about, well, what does it mean to be a person, and what does it mean to be part of something? And so Hellenism, one of its major features that ultimately is carried over into Western political thought as well, is this notion that individualistic pursuits are important, and that the individuals come together collectively to help to shape what the government and what the culture is going to look like. And so there's a significant attraction behind those things. So when we talk about the vision that Daniel saw, well, let's add on another vision from Daniel chapter 11. In Daniel chapter 11, Daniel sees another vision, and he gets another interpretation. And it says, "Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a fourth will gain far more riches than all of them. He will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases." And ultimately, this is also the king of Greece, the shaggy goat, the king of Greece, that is that singular horn that Daniel sees. And that is a reference to Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great lived longer than 12 years, but 334 to 322 is the extent of his reign. After his father, Philip of Macedon, died, he took over the Macedonian Empire, the Greek Empire essentially, conquered what was left of Greece that hadn't been conquered by his father, and then, as we've seen before, swept across the continent basically, and conquered all of, he moved down through here, conquered all the way down through Syria and this area, down to Egypt, came back up, and then basically went around conquering the entire Babylonian, Persian empires, all of it. He conquered it in the space of 12 years, which is phenomenal. I mean, it's astonishing that anyone would be able to do that. When we look in particular, though, at one area of Alexander's conquest, if we kind of zoom in on the area where Jerusalem is, and we can see that actually he conquered the area around Jerusalem fairly early on. He came down through here, conquered the rest of Greece, and then went into the Asia. This is Asia Minor here, and then came down through the Levant into these areas here. Now, ultimately, the 2 big battles that he fought were at Tyre and Gaza, because although the Jews would not like to hear this being said, the simple fact was that Jerusalem was not particularly strategically significant at that particular time. Jerusalem was in a location where there was a lot of trade that passed by, and if Jerusalem had been powerful, it would have been a dangerous place, because it would have been a place from which raids could be launched and fortifications could be held. But at that particular time, Jerusalem was not considered to be a major threat, because the people who lived there were not really a major threat. They were already clients of the Persian Empire, and so they were just not really an issue. But what's interesting is that after he conquers these 2 cities, rather than going on immediately down into Egypt, historians, particularly Josephus, says that he went to Jerusalem. We have to be a little bit careful with Josephus. Anybody know who Josephus is?
He was a historian in about the end of the 1st century, or
Yes.
2nd century.
That's correct.
Well, he wasn't active in it, so he got his information someplace else.
Well, yes, and that's true. He was not present for a lot of what happened. The main thing you got to remember about Josephus in the context of him as a historian is that Josephus is Jewish, and because of that, there is a significant element of Jewish propaganda, for lack of a better word, in some of his histories. A lot of what he describes happening, you have to take sort of with a grain of salt, because it's never quite clear whether, especially when he's talking about the Jews. When he's talking about other stuff, it's a little bit more safe. But when he's talking about Jews and Jewish issues, you have to be a little bit careful, because some of the time it's pretty obvious, or it seems pretty likely that he's exaggerating or putting maybe a happier face on what the Jews are doing, a more negative face on what their oppressors are doing, or whatever.
What was the years of his writing?
And, I don't actually remember. I don't have it in front of me right here. But he wrote two particular books, the Antiquities of the Jews 1 and 2, basically. And so, actually it says 1st century historian, so I'm assuming actually that was 1st century BC, but I'm not 100% sure of that. So anyway, so this is in Antiquities of the Jews. 1st century historian Josephus reports that during the siege of Tyre, so this is where Alexander besieges Tyre. Now by this time he's conquered all of this area here, but Jerusalem is still, he hasn't gotten that far south, and Jerusalem is still officially a protectorate or a realm of the Persian Empire. And the high priests of Jerusalem, who are pretty much in charge at this point, have sworn loyalty to the king of the Persian Empire, because he's their people, or he's their king. So Alexander sends a message to the high priest in Jerusalem, asking him to send men and provisions to help him in his siege of Tyre. The high priest answers back to him and says, sends messengers back, that he's sworn a vow to the Persian king Darius III, who was the king at that time, that he would not take up arms against him, and therefore he could not go back on his word as long as Darius III still lived. So Alexander, unsurprisingly, was really, really mad about this. And so it was actually the reason that Alexander had besieged Tyre and ultimately ransacked the city is because he had made requests of them and they had refused him as well. But because he's busy with Tyre, he doesn't mess with Jerusalem. So during this same time, the leader of the Samaritans, so these are the people who live in and around and mostly north of Jerusalem and of the Jews that are there, Samaritans, they see an opportunity to curry favor with Alexander, so they renounce Darius III, they send him soldiers, they send him provisions. So after a siege that lasted about a year, Tyre was defeated. Alexander then goes and he deals with Gaza, which actually didn't take nearly as long. Apparently, for whatever reason, it was a much shorter siege. So now he heads for Jerusalem, not because he needs to conquer it in terms of being able to conquer the areas where he plans to conquer, but because he's just angry about the fact that they did not support him. And so Josephus recounts this, and I'm going to read this word for word. So it says, Jadis the high priest, when he heard that Alexander was coming, was in agony and under terror, as not knowing how he should meet the Macedonians, since the king was displeased at his foregoing disobedience. He therefore ordained that the people should make supplications and should join with him in offering sacrifice to God, whom he besought to protect that nation and to deliver them from the perils that were coming upon them. Whereupon God warned him in a dream which came upon him after he had offered sacrifice, that he should take courage and adorn the city and open the gates, that the rest should appear in white garments, but that he and the priest should meet the king in the habits proper to their order, in other words, the priestly garments, without the dread of any ill consequences which the providence of God would prevent. And when Jadis understood that Alexander was not far from the city, he went out in procession with the priests and the multitude of citizens. So basically he throws open the gates of Jerusalem, which has historically not been the best way to deal with a besieging army. And he basically is trying to be as friendly and non-threatening as possible. And so Jadis takes this column of priests as well as prominent citizens out, and they meet the army of Alexander. Alexander is being accompanied by the Samaritans, who are probably looking to see what sorts of bad things he's going to do to the Jews and to Jerusalem. Because of that, the Samaritans may have even been hoping that they were going to be given control over Jerusalem. But instead, when they encounter the inhabitants of Jerusalem encounter Alexander, he sees him dressed in the robes of the high priest and in the turban and with the plate engraved with the name of God on it and everything else. And it says that he approached Janus, and he adored the name. In other words, he gave honor to the name of Yahweh, and he saluted the high priest, and he said to him that he had had a dream before he began his campaign of conquest, that in which the high priest had assured Alexander that he would be victorious over the Persians. And so Alexander was taken by the high priest into Jerusalem, where he actually offered a sacrifice to God at the temple, according to the high priest's directions. Some of this, like I said, we start to veer into the realm of what's very unlikely, because it's highly unlikely that the high priest would have taken a Greek into the temple to offer sacrifices, because they weren't allowed in the temple. And at this particular time, they didn't have the temple in its form under Herod, where there was a temple there was a courtyard for the Gentiles. There was just the temple proper, and the Greek should not be in there. But who knows? So Josephus also claims that when the book of Daniel was brought, to him while he was in Jerusalem, and it was shown to him where Daniel talks about the things we've just been looking at, that a Greek is going to destroy the empire of the Persians, and he concluded that was him, which his story would almost certainly bear out. And so he was glad, and he dismissed the multitude. And so ultimately, and this part, whatever is true or not true about what Josephus has said, ultimately, and we know historically that Alexander did not ransack Jerusalem, that instead he granted them basically the same rights that they enjoyed under Persian rule, and gave the Samaritans the same rights as well, and then basically left them alone, and it basically said, just kind of keep on what you're doing, I guess. One thing that's kind of interesting, and again, this one is actually historical, is if you look at the Talmud and some of the recountings under the Talmud, is that a number of the boys born in Jerusalem that year were named Alexander, or in Yiddish, there's a name Sindar, which is actually a popular name for Jewish boys even to this day, and it's a derivation of Alexander's name. So ultimately then Alexander leaves, after a short stay, leaves and goes on down and besieges Samaria, or besieges Egypt, and then heads back out to the main Persian Empire. So the point of this is, again, it's difficult to kind of differentiate what's true in Josephus' account versus what's an exaggeration in Josephus' account. What is true is definitely that Alexander did go up to Jerusalem, did ultimately decide not to go into battle against that city, and ultimately did leave the Jews as well as the Samaritans largely self-governing themselves, and certainly did not try to interfere with their religion or with their hierarchies or anything like that, but went on about his conquests and focused on those issues. And so he was not interested in trying to conquer Jerusalem or to enslave the Jewish people or something like that. So the Jews in general, within the Jewish histories, Alexander is remembered as a fairly benign ruler, a fairly benign character, because he did not, take the negative position on some of the people before them had, and certainly some of the later Greeks would as well. Okay, yeah.
Wasn't Alexander pretty much, when he conquered, he would leave whatever religion was there? He didn't try to change it like some of the other people had done.
Yes, and that was one of the characteristics of Hellenism, was that and it would later be adopted by the Roman Empire as one of their core approaches to conquest, which was, if you pay your taxes, we don't really care what you do as long as you're not destructive, So we are willing to leave your governments in place, we're willing to leave your religious institutions in place, as long as they don't cause us problems. We're not going to interfere with those things as long as we keep getting our taxes. And by this time, the Jews had lived long enough under the Persian rule, paying their taxes, paying their tribute, that the notion of paying it to somebody different wasn't a big deal. It wasn't like Alexander came in and said, I want 3 times as much or something like that. So ultimately, one of the strengths of both the Greek and the Roman empires was that they didn't try to homogenize the people. They weren't looking to make everybody believe all the same things. It's actually not until much later in the Roman Empire that you see some of the Roman emperors trying to impose emperor worship and things like that. And there are certainly times where the Romans would go in and say, okay, you have to stop doing this. But it usually was either because they were doing something that was just so horrific that even the Romans and the Greeks couldn't stand it, or because implicit or inherent in what they were doing was rebellion against the empire. So they would have to put a stop to it. But for the most part, Alexander, you can't conquer the whole world or this whole area in 12 years if you're going to try to change everybody to look like you. Now what does happen as Alexander is going through this process is that the Greeks that are coming with him are gradually settling in some of these areas where there had not been much of any Greek presence before. And it happens even more once he dies and his empire is split apart. But gradually, you have Greeks that are, I mean, it wasn't like the army was staying behind, but gradually you have Greeks that are coming and are taking positions in all of these different areas that he conquers, and that ultimately will become powerful and prominent in those areas because they're part of the Greek Empire as opposed to parts of the subjected areas that he rules over. Okay, so like I said, Alexander in general is viewed as a relative positive as far as the Jewish history goes because he dealt with the Jews reasonably and in a relatively kind fashion. So then if we go on in Daniel chapter 11, Daniel says, as soon as he has arisen, this is Alexander the Great, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out towards the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them. So what we see happening, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago, is that Alexander dies most likely of basically just some kind of internal illness that was not diagnosed and not treatable. He dies in, 323. He dies in 323. And so at that point, he has no heir. Now, technically, his wife was pregnant with his son at that time, but she didn't even know it at the time that he died. And so his son would not be born until about 7 months later, and by that time, the situation had devolved a long way away from any chance of the empire being maintained. So what happens instead? Well, first of all, like I said, Alexander doesn't know it. On his deathbed, he's asked, who do you want to leave the empire to? And his response most likely is to the strongest. So essentially what he seems to be saying is, whoever can take and hold it can keep it. And what happens is it turns out that no single person can take and hold it, just like the scripture says. Instead, the Diadochi become, or Diadochi, I can't remember how to pronounce that, become the heirs of the empire. And the Diadochi, that word Diadochi simply refers to successor. So it literally means the successor. So creative name, I guess, so to speak. And it takes them a couple of years to sort of consolidate their rule over their various areas. But eventually it breaks down into these 4 major areas. The first one is up here. This is it was Macedonia or Macedon. This area in here is Thrace, or it'll become Antigonia is what it'll be known as. This down in here, this biggest area, is what used to be Babylonia. This area in here is what used to be Syria. Well, it continues to be Syria. And this area over here is parts of Persia. This becomes the Seleucid Empire. And then down here, even though it's hard to distinguish from the Mediterranean Sea, is Egypt, and it becomes ruled by the Ptolemies. The kingdoms of the Diadochi, first 2, as I said, actually I misspoke about one of them. The one that we looked at first is Antagonid Macedon. Second one is Attalid Anatolia. Anatolia is that region, this orange region here. This is Macedon, that's Anatolia. Those 2 are relatively unimportant from the biblical perspective because neither one of them ever really, with one significant exception, really have anything to do with much of anything south of them. The 2 that are really important are Seleucid Mesopotamia and Central Asia, which is that huge area of yellow on the map, and then also Ptolemaic Egypt, which is that area down below it. Because if you looked on the map there, you can see, there we go, you can see that right in here is where Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria are, and you can see that the 2 of them are butting up against each other, and on this map even it suggests that Egypt encircles a section of the Seleucid Empire. It's kind of in the middle there, and that's because that is an area that is primarily the point of contest between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies for a period of more than 100 years, and that ultimately has profound implications for the Israelites because they're right there in the middle of that, only unlike before, they're no longer the masters of their own destiny. They're not the ones who are being conquered or conquering, they're just in the middle of this war that's going on between the north and the south. And that's exactly how Daniel refers to it. Daniel says the king of the south, that would be Ptolemy, will grow strong, along with one of his princes who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain a great dominion. After some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. When we talk about the king of the south, the first king of the south, the first king of Egypt, once you have the divided Grecian kingdoms, and remember, all of these kingdoms, even though they are ruled by different people and they are located in different places, they all consider themselves to be Greece. The people who are ruling them are Greeks, notwithstanding the fact that they may be in Egypt or that they may be in Syria or whatever. The people that are ruling them are Greeks. So the first ruler of Egypt is Ptolemy I Soter, who ruled from 323 to 285. Now, Ptolemy has a general. His general's name is Seleucus I Nicator. Seleucus is a very effective general for him, and Seleucus becomes really important because what happens is that Ptolemy is trying to hold on to not just Egypt, but also all of that area in Syria as well, all of that yellow that we saw earlier. And what happens is that a general by the name of Antiochus, I love this name, Monophthalmus, which basically means one eye because he got one of his eyes poked out in battle. So Antiochus is from Macedonia, which was way up higher. But he leads a conquest. He's trying to conquer all of Alexander's land again. He leads a conquest down into Syria, directed towards Egypt. And so Ptolemy and Seleucus band together in order to resist him. And ultimately they defeat him and drive him back. And in the process then, Ptolemy gives Seleucus control over that central yellow area of the empire that would become the Asia Minor, or not Asia Minor, that would become Syria and Babylonia and all that stuff. The problem is that once he gives him control, Seleucus doesn't really want to be under the control of Ptolemy anymore, so he breaks off and they basically become fairly hostile. So now you have this division where Egypt was planning to control Egypt as well as all of that area in yellow north of there. Ultimately the Seleucids take over the northern area and the Ptolemies continue to control down in Egypt. Ptolemy the first successor is Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Ptolemy II Philadelphus becomes king, and shortly after that, or sometime after that, Antiochus II Theos, who is the descendant of, or the son of Seleucus I, becomes, he's the grandson of Seleucus I. Seleucus I, that guy up there, his son is Antiochus I. His son is Antiochus. By the way, Antiochus, these are named after Antioch, the city that is founded by one of Alexander's generals during his conquests, which will become a very important city later on. So Antiochus II Theos is king at the same time that Ptolemy II is, and ultimately they're trying to conclude a peace treaty. And the peace treaty that they come up with is that Ptolemy II will send his daughter Berenice to marry Antiochus II, and that will be the basis for peace. And if you remember what we just looked at in Daniel a minute ago, that's exactly what he said was going to happen. That the king of the north and the king of the south would seek to find a treaty, form a treaty, and they would basically exchange they would form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south would come, so the daughter of the king of the south, the daughter of Ptolemy, would go to the king of the north to marry and carry out a peaceful arrangement. So Daniel's predictions are right on line here, and that's exactly what we see in history. Then he goes on, Daniel does, and says, she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power. So Berenice and Antiochus II, he's saying they're not going to remain with their power. She will be given up along with those who brought her in. See what you did? And the one who sired her, as well as he who supported her in those times. But one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place. So it turns out that it's not quite as simple as I said a minute ago in terms of Antiochus marrying Bernice. The problem is that Antiochus was already married. He was married to a woman whose name was Laodice, basically. Again, we see this coming from Laodicea, or a relationship between the two. But his wife's name was Laodice, and Laodice did not, in order to marry her, in order to marry Berenice, he had to divorce Laodice, so he divorced her and left her back kind of in the eastern areas. So a lot of what's going on here is happening kind of in that area close to the Mediterranean. He leaves her back further in the east, and he thinks that's kind of the end of it, which if you know most women, it is not the end of it. So Laodice thinks that, so Antiochus marries Berenice, and everything is fine until till he goes back to kind of check on the eastern part of his empire, at which point Laodice poisons him, kills him, and then basically puts her son up as the ruler of the Seleucid Empire. When he does that, then, and around that same time, actually I should say that Berenice's father, the Ptolemy II, dies. It's unconnected to this, it just happens to take place at about the same time. So Ptolemy II dies, at which point then Egypt is weakened briefly because of his death. And it kind of looks like Laodice may have acted at that point when she knew that was the moment to strike, basically, because Egypt was weakened and the alliance was weakened. So she poisons Antiochus, and then she moves with her son towards the eastern, I said the east is actually west, yeah, to the west, moves towards the west, to the western part of the Seleucid Empire. And when she does that, then Ptolemy III, who was actually Berenice's half-brother, he is the son of Ptolemy II, she was his daughter, he takes an army and basically heads for where his sister Berenice and her son Antiochus are living. He heads that way to support them. The problem is that by the time he gets there, Laodice and her son have already gotten there, and they have killed Berenice and her child, and they have taken over essentially the government, and at that point it falls into the hands of Laodice's son. But when Ptolemy gets there and finds that out, he's not like, well, I guess we should just go home now. His response is, let's lay waste to everything we can find. So he starts a war, and this war ends up going quite a ways. And Daniel says this: he will come against their army, that is Ptolemy III, and into the fortress of the king of the north, that is Antiochus Laodice and Antiochus III is basically, but he will deal with them and display great strength. Initially, there are some setbacks for the Egyptian army, but once they get their feet under them, they just really are very successful. And he says, also their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, he will take into captivity to Egypt. And in fact, we know that what this is talking about ultimately is the Third Syrian War, where as I said, what is his name? Ptolemy III conquers much of the southern portion, southwestern portion of Syria, and ultimately takes back with him supposedly 40,000 talents of gold and a bunch of statues of Egyptian gods. Takes them back to Egypt with him. The Egyptian gods had been taken by the Greeks earlier and been moved out, and so he basically takes them back again along with some of the Syrian gods and things like that. So this is actually the Third Syrian War. There were two others before this fought between the fathers and grandfathers of some of these guys. Jerry?
How does history look at the scripture that you're reading with here? I mean, we're accepting that, but how do the historians look at the prophecy of Daniel?
The general historical consensus, if you take it out of the Christian historical context, is that Daniel was written sometime in the 2nd century BC, so sometime in the 110 to 150 something range like that. The belief is that if you look at, and with particularly the prophecies that we're going to be looking at in Daniel chapter 11, they basically go up to the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, who is, we won't get to him until next week, but they go to the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, which is about 100 years after this happens. And they stop there, and they don't even get to the end of his rule. They don't accurately predict what's going to happen to him. And so it strongly suggests, from the historian perspective, since they don't accept the notion of prophecy, it strongly suggests that it was written by someone who was conversant with history up to around that period of time. And then after that would not be any longer conversant with history. But also someone who was at least aware of the fact that the Roman Empire was growing, because obviously in a number of his predictions is talking about the Roman Empire coming. And by the time you get to 150 or 110 or so, it's obvious the Roman Empire is becoming great and powerful. So the history says that's when it was written. There are some reasons why history thinks that. There are a couple of places where Greek idioms are used that suggest that didn't exist at the time that Daniel would have been written if it were historically written when it claims to be written. There are a few other things like that, some like anachronisms are what they're called, things that would seem to be out of place in what was being written if it was written in the time that it claims to have been written in. That's problematic if you do accept the notion of prophecy, though, because a lot of those anachronisms can be explained by someone who has knowledge of the future. Ultimately, the largest argument historians have against Daniel being written by Daniel during the time of the Persian Empire is the fact that this prophecy in particular is so precise. They can't stand the notion that that could actually be that accurate because no one's ever been that accurate. You know, that people get all excited about people like Nostradamus and their supposed predictions, but Nostradamus is so vague that it's easy to assign his prophecies to whatever. As things happen, it's easy to plug them in and say, well, that's what he was talking about. Now, certainly there are examples of prophecies being made in the Old Testament that were fulfilled in the Old Testament. You know, like Elijah saying it won't rain for until I say it will, and then 3 years it doesn't. For 3 years it doesn't rain. But there's no way to independently verify that that's what really happened. And there's other prophecies. You know, ones like the prophets, the claim that there were the prophets that came down from Jerusalem and prophesied that there would be a famine in the whole Roman realm. Well, the famine definitely happened, but historians are going to say, well, maybe there weren't really prophets that came and said that. You know, maybe somebody just made that up. The problem with Daniel is that Daniel is set in a time period that way precedes these events, or at least that significantly precedes many of these events, and yet it predicts with great accuracy events that are historically verifiable. And so it creates problems for the for historians because they can't accept the notion that someone could be this accurate. Even the prophecies of the Messiah are not as specific as Daniel's prophecies are. So it's easier to believe that these are simply somebody writing it down and making it sound like it's a prophecy, being vague enough that it's not, you know, obviously they're just recounting history, but writing it down to make it sound like it's a prophecy when it's really just somebody recounting what they know is true after the fact and pretending like it's before the fact. And that's essentially the argument that you see in history. The other argument, I forgot, one other argument, probably I would argue, or I would believe is the most significant of all of them, is that Daniel, the book of Daniel, was not in the canon of the prophets that the Jews had assembled by about 200 BC. It was not added to the canon of the prophets until sometime after 200 BC, which raises the question, if it was written all the way back in 500 or so, why was it not included at that particular time? And I don't have an answer for that, but that is one of the issues that is raised by historians. Mark, were you going to ask?
Could it be because he was from back there?
It's possible. I mean, there's a possibility that Daniel's scrolls, what he wrote, wasn't necessarily kept as part of the records of. Why would it be? He wasn't living with the Jewish people, and unlike most of the other characters like Ezra and Nehemiah, who are coming from Persia back to Jerusalem, where they're ultimately what they wrote might be left and added to the canon. Daniel's writings might not have been ultimately discovered or added until much later because he wasn't local, and ultimately they may have been part of the writings, the collected writings of the Persian Empire rather than of the Israelites until at some point they were discovered. So there are definitely some possibilities, but like I said, it is the most problematic of all of the issues is the fact that it was apparently unknown to the Jews, or at least not accepted as true by the Jews, one or the other, until well after they closed out the books of the canon and assembled them and said, this is the whole thing. Now the Jews would go on later to add Daniel in, but not until later. So, okay, so where are we at here? So we come to, so we talked about this in the Third Syrian War. Continues and says, and he on his part, this is the king of the south, the Ptolemies, will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years, and then the latter, that would be the king of the south, the Ptolemies, will enter the realm of the king of the south, that would be the king of the north, the Seleucid king, will enter the realm of the king of the south, but he'll return to his own land. And what we see actually there is that after we have Ptolemy III, Seleucus II, who is the one that Ptolemy ends up, he's the descendant of, he's the one that takes over from his father Antiochus. He's the son of Laodicea, he initially at least kind of operates at peace because he got beat so badly by the Egyptians in the Third Syrian War, but eventually he becomes strong enough that he starts doing raids against some of the northern Egyptian holdings, but never really invades Egypt specifically. So he kind of goes down there, but he doesn't really invade, doesn't really conquer specifically. Okay, so where are we at time-wise? Yeah, let's stop here because the next part is kind of a big enough section that it will take a while to get through this. So we will hold off on that till next week and pick up after Seleucus II and talk about what happened then. Because actually we've gotten kind of the point where now we're going to start seeing these battles and the effects of these battles in the Promised Land, in and around, not in Jerusalem itself, but in and around Jerusalem, and the impacts are going to start to be greater. I will say this, I'll go into this in more detail next week or a week after, depending on how far we get. But during this period of time, the area around Jerusalem kind of changes hands back and forth, but for the most part it's under Egyptian control, the Ptolemies. And the Ptolemies adopted Alexander's approach, which was basically just pay your tithe or pay your taxes. Tribute was what they really called it, but pay your tribute and you can do what you want to. And so and to the extent that there was pulling back and forth, the chaos actually was beneficial to the Jews because for the most part, since they weren't involved in it, and it wasn't like they were warring over the Jewish cities, those were not the cities of consequence at this time, the Jews were basically able to kind of stay hands off and let these two powers fight over kind of the area in general because their fights weren't causing a lot of trouble in their lands. So during this period of time, despite the fact that there's a lot of wars and chaos happening around them, the Jews are actually living in a relatively peaceful and stable situation because they haven't really been implicated in what's going on. And that's going to change later on, but it will take a while to get to that point. And so for a period of time at least, the Jews are in a relatively good position. Okay, we're going to stop and we will take a break.